The alley behind Jimmy's diner reeked of grease and yesterday's trash, a sour tang that clung to the back of Jamal Carter's throat as he hauled a bulging garbage bag toward the dumpster. It was late, later than he'd meant to stay, his shift dragging past midnight under the flicker of a dying neon sign that buzzed like a trapped fly. His arms ached, muscles tight from hours of scrubbing sticky tables, pouring endless coffee refills, and balancing trays of burgers and fries. The cold bit at his knuckles, raw from the dishwater, and his breath puffed out in small clouds against the October chill. At 16, Jamal was used to long days, school, then work, then home to the cramped apartment he shared with his mom, Lena, but tonight felt heavier, like the weight of the world had settled into his bones. He was halfway to the dumpster when he saw it, a shadow slumped against the brick wall, half hidden by a pile of torn cardboard. At first, he thought it was just more junk, another mess to ignore. But then it moved, a shiver of motion, frail and unsteady, like a leaf caught in a gust. Jamal froze, the garbage bag slipping slightly in his grip. His heart gave a quick, uneasy thud. He squinted into the dimness, the street lamp casting a weak glow over a figure, an old man. His gray hair wild and matted, his beard a tangled mess framing a face so thin it looked carved from shadow. The man's hands, bony and trembling, clawed through a crumpled plastic bag, pulling out a soggy bread crust. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with a vacant stare, his pale eyes foggy, like he wasn't really seeing it or anything. Jamal's stomach twisted, a sharp pang of something he couldn't name. Pity, maybe, or guilt. He'd seen homeless folks before, curled up under bus stops or shuffling past the diner's windows, but he'd never stopped, never looked too long. His mom's voice echoed in his head. We ain't got enough for ourselves. Jamal, buena shirvicherno. Keep walking, Shirnamon. And she was right. The lights at home flickered every month, threatening to go dark if the bills didn't get paid. But this was different. The old man looked like he might break apart right there, dissolve into the cold and be gone by morning. Hey, sir. Jamal's voice cracked, awkward and too loud in the quiet alley. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch, just kept staring at that crust like it held some secret. Jamal shifted his weight, the garbage bag thudding against his leg. He cleared his throat, louder this time. You okay? The words felt clumsy, useless, but he couldn't just walk away. Not yet. The old man blinked, slow and deliberate, like he'd just woken up, his head tilted up, those cloudy eyes locking onto Jamal's face. For a second, he looked confused, like he didn't know where he was or who this kid standing over him might be. Then, sorry, we after a long, heavy pause, Edinor Saram din Gabernaporn. He nodded, just once. No words, just that small, shaky gesture. Jamal chewed his lip, glancing back at the diner's back door. He wasn't supposed to take food, Jimmy. Fear. The owner was a stickler about that, but they tossed out leftovers every night anyway. Burgers nobody ate, fries gone cold, stuff that had just rot in the dumpster. Hold on, he muttered, more to himself than the man, and turned back toward the kitchen. Inside, the heat hit him like a wall, the smell of frying onions and burnt coffee wrapping around him. He moved fast, grabbing a styrofoam container from the stack by the sink and piling in a burger, still warm. Bun a little smashed and a handful of fries. His hands shook slightly, nerves buzzing. If Jimmy caught him, he'd get chewed out, maybe worse. But the old man's face, those trembling hands, stuck in his mind like a splinter. He snapped the lid shut and slipped back outside, the cold slapping his cheeks as he crouched down in front of the man. Here, he said, holding out the container. You should eat. The old man stared at it, unblinking, like he couldn't believe it was real. His fingers twitched, hesitant, then reached out. When they brushed Jamal's mush, they were ice cold, so fragile Jamal half expected them to snap. Thank you, the man rasped, his voice rough and faint, like it hadn't been used in days. Jamal nodded, standing up and shoving his hands deep into his jacket pockets. He should go. His mom would be pacing by now, her shift at the nursing home long over, waiting for him to walk through the door. But he lingered, watching as the man took a slow, careful bite, chewing like it was the first real food he'd had in weeks. Jamal shifted again, the gravel crunching under his sneakers. What's your name? Reverend, he asked, the question spilling out before he could stop it. The man paused, his brows knitting together. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Like the answer was a puzzle he couldn't solve. I, I don't remember, he said finally, his voice cracking. He looked down at the food, his fingers tightening around the container. I think, maybe, Marcus. He said it like a question, testing it out, then sighed, long and weary. It comes and goes. Some days I know stuff. Others, it's like I'm nowhere. He touched his forehead, tracing a faint, jagged scar half hidden under his messy hair. There was an accident. I think I hit my head. After that, I just started getting lost. Jamal's chest tightened. He'd heard about people losing their memories, head injuries, trauma, but seeing it up close was different. Marcus, if that was his name, looked like a ghost, drifting through a world he couldn't hold on to. You don't have anyone looking for you? Jamal asked, his voice softer now, almost afraid of the answer. Marcus shook his head, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, like he wasn't sure. Jamal exhaled sharply, running a hand over his fade. He didn't know what he'd expected. Some sob story, maybe some, or a quick excuse to leave, but not this. A man with no past, no place, just sitting there in the alley like he'd been erased. He should have walked away right then, should have said goodnight and headed home. But when he glanced back, Marcus was trying to pull a thin, ragged blanket tighter around his shoulders, his hands shaking harder against the cold. Jamal's jaw clenched. He couldn't leave him like this. Not tonight. Come with me, Sarjinawamidi, he said, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. Marcus blinked up at him, confusion clouding his face. What, His voice was small, uncertain. Jamal shifted, scuffing his sneaker against the ground. I mean, my mom won't care if you crash on our couch. It's not much, but it's warm, better than out here. He didn't know if that was true. Lena might care a lot, but he couldn't take it back now. Marcus just stared, like he was weighing whether this kid was for real. Then, slowly, he nodded. Jamal turned and started walking, and Marcus followed, his steps slow and uneven, like he wasn't sure his legs would hold him. The streets were quiet, the city holding its breath under a sky streaked with gray clouds. Jamal kept his hands buried in his pockets, the cold seeping through his thin jacket. Behind him, Marcus shuffled along, his breathing shallow and ragged. Every few steps, Jamal glanced back, half expecting the old man to vanish into the shadows. It was weird hours ago. Marcus was just another stranger, another face to ignore. Now Jamal felt tethered to him, like letting him trail behind was the only thing keeping him from disappearing completely. He didn't know how his mom would take this. Lena was tough, had to be, raising him alone on a nurse's aide salary, but she had a soft spot too. He just hoped it was soft enough tonight. Their apartment building loomed ahead, a squat, peeling relic with flickering hallway lights. Jamal could see the glow of their living room window, faint and warm against the night. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the knob. Maybe this was dumb. Maybe Lena would freak, tell Marcus to get out, and Jamal would have to watch him shuffle back into the dark. His stomach knotted at the thought. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The smell of chicken noodle soup hit him first, canned. Sheep bidiwar, exembiki. But home, Lena stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon. Her braids were pulled into a messy bun, and her scrubs hung loose on her frame, exhaustion etched into every line of her body. She turned at the sound of the door, her dark eyes narrowing when she saw Jamal and the stranger behind him. The air went still, thick with unspoken questions. Jamal, she said, her voice low and careful. Who's this? Jamal swallowed, his throat dry. This is Marcus Omar. He said, quieter than he meant to. He doesn't have anywhere to go. Lena's gaze shifted to Marcus, taking him in, the sunken cheeks, the trembling hands, the way he stood there like he might blow away. Her lips pressed into a thin line, not mad, but thinking. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. Stepping closer, Jamal braced himself, ready for the lecture. We can't afford this. You know that. But it didn't come. I made extra soup, she said instead, turning back to the stove. Come in. Sit, Pijo Warren. Her tone was firm but not harsh, the kind she used when she'd already made up her mind. Jamal let out a shaky breath. nodding at Marcus to follow. The old man stepped inside, hesitant, like he expected the floor to give out under him. He sat at their rickety kitchen table, hands folded in his lap, while Lena ladled soup into a chip bowl and set it in front of him. Marcus stared at it, his eyes wide, like he couldn't believe someone would just give him something. Then he picked up the spoon, his movements slow and deliberate, and took a sip. A tiny, relieved sigh slipped out, and Jamal felt something loosen in his chest. Lena sat across from him, her sharp eyes softening just a fraction. "You got family?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Marcus paused, the spoon hovering over the bowl. He glanced at Jamal, then back at her, searching for an answer he didn't have. I don't know," he whispered. "I don't remember." Lena frowned but didn't push. She just nodded, breaking off a piece of stale bread and sliding it next to his bowl. "You can stay tonight," she said. "We ain't got much, but it's warm." Marcus's lips parted, his brows furrowing like he didn't know how to take it. Gratitude. Maybe, or disbelief. He nodded stiffly and went back to his soup, eating like it might vanish if he stopped. Jamal watched, his mind spinning. He'd expected a fight, a reason to send Marcus away. But Lena had looked at him and seen the same thing Jamal had. A man who needed help, even if they didn't have much to give. Later, lying on the couch while Marcus slept under a threadbare blanket in the corner, Jamal stared at the ceiling. The streetlights threw shifting shadows across the room, and he couldn't shake the feeling that bringing Marcus here was going to change something. Everything. The next morning, the air was sharp with the scent of wet pavement and distant coffee. Jamal tugged his hoodie tighter as he stepped outside, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Marcus followed, clutching the oversized coat Lena had dug out of a closet. His steps were slow, uncertain, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to come along or stay behind. Jamal glanced back and gave a small nod, and Marcus shut the door with a quiet click. Lena was already gone, off to her early shift, leaving the apartment empty and cold. So Marcus trailed Jamal, a silent shadow on the walk to Jimmy's diner. Jamal didn't know what he was doing. He hadn't planned this far, just figured Marcus could sit outside while he worked, maybe grab him some food during a break. But when they reached the diner, Marcus stopped, his pale eyes flicking to the warm glow spilling from the windows. "I can help," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. Jamal frowned. "What nuts to resign? I can help," Marcus repeated, standing a little straighter, though he still looked frail enough to collapse. "I used to work. I think I did. I don't remember what, but I know I did something." He looked at the diner, a spark of something, determination, maybe, flickering in his eyes. "I don't want to just sit out here." Jamal opened his mouth to argue. Marcus didn't look strong enough to lift a tray, let alone work, but before he could, the door swung open. Jimmy stepped out, rubbing his hands against the cold. He was a big guy, graying at the temples, with a permanent scowl that hit a heart softer than he'd admit. He sized Marcus up, then turned to Jamal, one brow raised. "You picking up strays now?" "Carter." Jamal tensed. No. This is Marcus. Greasy. He doesn't have anywhere to go. Jimmy cut him off with a grunt, waving a hand. He studied Marcus again, then jerked his chin toward the diner. "Come on in, old man, Miss Sirin. You can wipe tables, don't break nothing." Marcus blinked, startled, and Jamal's jaw dropped. "Wait, really?" he blurted. Jimmy just snorted. "Not like I'm paying him." Marcus nodded, his hands curling into weak fists like he was steeling himself, and followed Jimmy inside. Jamal scrambled after them, still reeling. Inside, the diner hummed with life, bacon sizzling, coffee brewing, the jukebox crooning some old Motown tune. Jimmy tossed Jamal his apron and pointed at Marcus. "Give him something easy. Tables with sartikuwons. Trash. He gets in the way. He's out." Jamal nodded, handing Marcus a rag. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you one." Marcus took it, his grip shaky but sure. And for the first time since Jamal met him, he didn't look lost. He had something to do, even if it was just wiping down tables. The day blurred by, strange and fast. Jamal kept an eye on Marcus, expecting him to tire out or wander off. But he didn't. He moved slow, deliberate. Irana could mastermind, wiping surfaces with a quiet focus Jamal hadn't seen before. Customers barely noticed him at first, just another worker in the background. But then they did. An old guy in a plaid jacket squinted as Marcus passed, muttering, "Hey, ain't you?" Marcus froze, turning slightly, a flicker of something crossing his face before it faded. "I don't know," he said softly, and shuffled on. Jamal saw it all, his gut twisting. Marcus wasn't just some nobody. He'd been someone people recognized, even if he couldn't. And then, near the end of his shift, it happened. Jamal was dragging trash out back when his sneaker hit something. A crumpled flyer, damp but readable. He bent down, heart thudding as he saw the photo. Marcus, cleaner, sharper, murder, but unmistakable. Missing, Marcus Reed. Last seen 3 months ago. If found, contact. An address followed. Not some shelter. A unsure, but a real house. Jamal's breath hitched. Marcus had a family. He shoved the flyer into his pocket and bolted inside. Crossing the diner in long strides, Marcus was by the window, wiping a table. When Jamal grabbed his arm, he said, voice tight with urgency. The old man looked up, startled. Jamal pulled out the flyer, hands shaking. "I found this." Marcus took it, slow and careful, his eyes scanning the paper. Then he gasped, a sharp, broken sound. His whole body trembled, fingers digging into the flyer until it crinkled. "I know this place," he whispered, his voice raw. He pressed a hand to his temple, like he could force the memory back. This is my home?" His eyes snapped to Jamal's, wild and desperate. "We gotta go. Now?" Jamal didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, ignoring Jimmy's gruff, "Go, kid, sure is fine in a once," and followed Marcus out into the dusk. The old man moved faster than Jamal had ever seen, clutching the flyer like it was his only tether to the world. They took a bus, no one to find anyone, the ride tense and silent. Marcus staring out the window, lips moving like he was piecing himself back together. When they reached the stop, he bolted off, Jamal trailing behind as they hit a quiet suburban street, big houses, neat lawns, a world miles from Jamal's own. Marcus stopped dead in front of a white two-story house, porch light glowing. "That's it, Tomersun," he breathed, stumbling forward. He pressed the doorbell with a shaking hand. And when the door opened, a man stood there, tall, some 30s, sharp features crumpling as he saw Marcus. "Dad, he choked out, voice breaking. Marcus staggered back, then forward, collapsing into his son's arms, sobbing, deep, wrenching cries that shook them both. Jamal stepped away, throat tight, feeling like he'd stumbled into something too big, too private. He didn't wait for thanks, just turned and walked home, the weight of the last few days lifting with every step. Days later, Marcus and his son, David Wihinaninasu, showed up at the diner. Marcus cleaned up, steady, alive in a way he hadn't been. He hugged Jamal, firm and real, whispering, "You saved me." David offered Lena a job, stable, with benefits, and promised Jamal's school worries were over. In that moment, everything shifted. A ripple from one small act of kindness Jamal hadn't known would change their lives forever. The walk home from that quiet suburban street felt like a dream. The kind where Jamal's feet moved but his mind lagged behind, still stuck on the porch where Marcus Reed had crumpled into his son's arms. The air was cool, sharp with the bite of late fall, and the distant hum of traffic buzzed in his ears like static. His sneakers scuffed the pavement, each step lighter than the last, as if shedding the weight of the past week. The worry, the uncertainty, the nagging ache of not knowing if he'd done the right thing. By the time he pushed open the apartment door, the familiar smell of Lena's cooking, something simple, maybe stew from whatever was left in the fridge, wrapped around him like a hug he didn't know he needed. The dim light of their single-bulb kitchen fixture flickered, casting soft shadows across the peeling linoleum. But tonight it didn't feel oppressive. It just felt like home. Lena turned from the stove, her spoon pausing mid-stir, her tired eyes catching his as he stepped inside. She was still in her scrubs, faded blue and wrinkled from a 12-hour shift, her braids slipping loose from their bun. "You're late." "Arm. You sure in once," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of concern she tried to hide behind a frown. Then her gaze sharpened, flicking past him to the empty space where Marcus should have been. "Where's your friend?" Jamal dropped his backpack onto the couch, the old springs creaking under the weight. A smile tugged at his lips. Small at first, then wider, realer than he'd felt in days. He found his way home, he said, stretching his arms overhead, the soreness in his shoulders easing just a little. Lena set the spoon down, turning fully now, her hands resting on her hips as she studied him. She didn't say anything right away, just watched, like she could see the shift in him, the way his shoulders weren't hunched quite so tight, the way his eyes didn't dart away like they usually did when he was hiding something. "Welcome, where you reckon, she repeated, her tone softer now. Curious. Jamal nodded, sinking onto the couch and kicking off his sneakers. Well, yeah. Found a flyer out back at the diner. Had his picture on it, missing for 3 months. Took him to the address. And his son was there. They're good now. He didn't tell her about the crying, the way Marcus had collapsed like a dam breaking, or how David's face had shattered with relief. Those weren't his moments to share, but he could feel them still, heavy and bright in his chest. Lena's lips curved, just a little, a rare, quiet smile that softened the lines exhaustion had carved into her face. Good or on him on him on. Rest her, she said simply, turning back to the stove. Sit down. Food's almost ready. And that was it, no lecture. No questions, just the clink of a bowl against the counter as she ladled out dinner. They ate together that night, the small table wobbling under their elbows. And for once, it didn't feel like they were just getting by. The stew was thin, mostly broth and a few chunks of potato, but it warmed Jamal from the inside out. They didn't talk much. Lena never was one for chatter, but the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, like the air had cleared of something neither of them had named. He slept hard that night. No dreams, no restless tossing, just the deep, blank rest of someone who'd finally let go of something. The next morning, he was back at Jimmy's diner, slipping into the rhythm like nothing had changed, wiping tables, dodging cranky regulars, refilling coffee cups until his wrists ached. The jukebox played its usual loop of scratchy soul tunes, and the air smelled of bacon grease and burnt toast. Everything was the same, except it wasn't. Jamal kept catching himself glancing at the door, half expecting Marcus to shuffle in, rag in hand, ready to wipe down tables with that slow, careful focus. But the old man was gone, back where he belonged. And Jamal was okay with that. More than okay, he felt good, like he'd done something that mattered. The morning rush was just dying down, the booths thinning out. When the door chime jingled, Jamal looked up from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, and froze. There, framed in the doorway, stood Marcus Reed, but not the Marcus he'd found in the alley. This Marcus was clean-shaven, his wild gray hair combed back, revealing that faint scar along his temple like a badge of survival. He wore a pressed button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to look casual but sharp, and his eyes, those pale, foggy eyes, were clear now, bright with something Jamal couldn't place. Beside him stood David, tall and polished in a dark suit that screamed money. The kind of guy who didn't belong in a greasy spoon like Jimmy's. But there they were, stepping inside like they'd come for something specific. Jamal's heart thudded. Be a quick, unsteady rhythm. He didn't move, didn't know what to say. Just watched as Marcus's face broke into a smile. Warm, real, serial warm. The kind that lit up the whole room. Jamal, Marcus said, his voice steady now. No trace of that hoarse whisper from the alley. Before Jamal could react, Marcus crossed the diner in a few quick steps and pulled him into a hug. It caught him off guard. Jamal stiffened, arms awkward at his sides, not used to this kind of thing. But Marcus's grip was firm, solid, like he meant it, and slowly Jamal relaxed, patting the old man's back once, twice, before Marcus let go. You saved me, Marcus said, stepping back just enough to meet Jamal's eyes. His voice was low, thick with something raw. You didn't have to, but you did. Jamal swallowed hard, his throat tight. He shrugged, trying to play it off. But the weight of those words hit him square in the chest. You followed me first, he mumbled, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Marcus chuckled, a soft, rumbling sound that made him seem younger. Lighter. Not so much. Might be true, he said, then stepped aside, gesturing to David. This is my son. Wanted him to meet you proper. David moved forward, extending a hand. His grip was strong, confident, but his eyes held something deeper, gratitude. Maybe, or respect. Jamal shook it, feeling the calluses on David's palm, a contrast to the crisp suit and polished shoes. You didn't just help my dad, David said, his voice calm but carrying weight. You gave him back to me. I don't think there's anything that could repay that. Jamal blinked, unsure what to do with that. He wasn't used to thanks, not like this. Not from someone who looked like he could buy the diner 10 times over. But David wasn't done. We'd like to talk to your mom, he said, glancing around the diner, taking in the cracked vinyl booths and the buzzing neon sign. If she's home, we'd love to stop by. Jamal's stomach flipped. My mom Marf sure do you mas, he echoed. Thrown off, when it tortoise sunners for Marcus nodded, his smile softening. If she raised you to be this way, we owe her a thank you too. Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. This was real. They were serious. He glanced at Jimmy, who'd been watching from behind the counter, arms crossed, a rare smirk tugging at his lips. Go on. Jimmy grunted, waving him off. Clock out. To warning the dirt. The drive home was quiet. The hum of David's sleek black car, a stark contrast to the rattling buses Jamal was used to. Marcus sat in the front, staring out the window like he was seeing the city for the first time, while Jamal fidgeted in the back, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. He didn't know what to expect. Lena wasn't one for surprises, and strangers showing up at their door wasn't exactly normal. When they pulled up to the apartment building, the cracked concrete steps and faded paint looked shabbier than usual next to David's car. Jamal led the way inside, his pulse thumping as he pushed open the door. Lena was at the kitchen table, a stack of bills spread out in front of her. Her brow furrowed as she scribbled numbers on a notepad. She looked up, startled, when Jamal walked in, and her eyes widened when Marcus and David followed. Jamal, she said, standing slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her voice was cautious, guarded down one, like she was bracing for bad news. Lena one for Nuria Wanyurnash. Right, David said, stepping forward with a smooth confidence that filled the tiny room. He offered his hand. I'm David Reed. This is my father, Marcus. Lena shook his hand, her grip firm, but her eyes flicking to Jamal, searching for an explanation. Your son saved my dad's life. David continued, his tone steady. We wanted to return the favor. Lena's lips parted, surprise flashing across her face. Return the favor, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. David glanced around the apartment, the chipped walls, the flickering light, the pile of overdue notices, and his expression softened. Not with pity, but understanding. My company's got some openings, he said casually, like it was no big deal. I'd like to offer you one, something stable, with benefits. Two, Lena's breath caught, her hand tightening at her side. She looked at Jamal, then back at David, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She stopped, her voice faltering. David smiled, small but genuine. And for Jamal, he added, turning to him, we'd like to make sure school's never a worry again. Tuition, books, whatever he needs. Jamal's stomach dropped, his mouth falling open. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening with something she didn't let out often. Relief, disbelief, hope all tangled together. The room went quiet, the weight of it sinking in. Marcus stepped forward, resting a hand on Jamal's shoulder. You helped me find my way home. Musid Sherman, he said, his voice warm, steady. Now it's our turn to help you. And just like that, the world shifted. Lena took the job, a clerical position at David's tech firm, with a salary that didn't just cover bills but let her breathe. Jamal's college fund started with a check David wrote that week, enough to make his head spin. The apartment didn't change overnight. The paint still peeled. The light still flickered, but it felt different, like the air wasn't so heavy anymore. Marcus came by sometimes, not as the lost man from the alley, but as a friend, sharing stories of the life he'd pieced back together. And Jamal won you on us. He kept working at Jimmy's, but now it was by choice, not necessity. Every shift, every wiped table, reminded him of the night he'd stopped in that alley, and how one small decision had rippled out to change everything. The weeks that followed felt like a slow unraveling of the life Jamal Carter had always known. A life stitched together with tight budgets, late-night shifts, and the constant hum of worry that buzzed in the background like a radio left on low. It didn't happen all at once. The changes crept in quiet and steady, like the way dawn sneaks over the horizon before you realize the dark's gone. Lena started her new job at David Reed's company the Monday after their visit, trading her worn-out scrubs for a pair of slacks and a blouse she'd pulled from the back of her closet, ironed crisp for the first time in years. Jamal caught her that morning, standing in front of their cracked bathroom mirror, smoothing her braids with a nervous hand. "How do I look?" she'd asked, her voice light but edged with something shaky, like she wasn't sure she could pull this off. "Like you're about to run the place," Jamal said, leaning against the doorframe with a grin. She'd swatted at him with a towel, laughing, a real laugh. Not the tired half-chuckle she usually managed, but he saw the spark in her eyes, the kind that hadn't been there since he was a kid. That first paycheck came 2 weeks later, and when she opened the envelope at the kitchen table, her fingers trembled just enough for Jamal to notice. "This is more than I made in a month at the nursing home," she whispered, staring at the numbers like they might vanish if she blinked. She didn't say much after that, just folded the check back into the envelope and started cooking dinner. Real dinner, with chicken she'd bought fresh, not frozen, and a side of greens that didn't come from a can. Jamal didn't ask what the money meant to her. He didn't have to. He saw it in the way her shoulders straightened, the way she hummed under her breath while she stirred the pot. Something old, maybe a hymn she'd picked up from her mom years ago. For Jamal, "Mes friends with nothing." The shift was quieter, but just as real. David's promise about school wasn't some empty gesture. A week after that day at the diner, a letter arrived from a college prep program Jamal hadn't even applied to, offering him a spot with tuition covered, books, fees, or everything. He'd sat on the couch with it in his hands, the paper crinkling under his grip, rereading the words until they blurred. College had always been a maybe, a distant if we can swing it that he and Lena never talked about too loud, like saying it might jinx the whole thing. Now it was real, stamped and sealed, and all because he'd stopped in that alley one night. He didn't tell anyone at school yet, not his boys, not his teachers, just tucked the letter into his backpack and carried it around like a secret he wasn't ready to share. It felt too big, too fragile, like if he let it out, it might slip away. Jimmy's diner stayed the same, though, a stubborn anchor in the middle of all the change. Jamal kept his shifts, clocking in after school with his apron slung over his shoulder. The grease-stained routine, a comfort he wasn't ready to let go of. Jimmy grumbled about it once. "You don't need this gig no more, kid, or go study or something." But Jamal just shrugged and said, "Keeps me out of trouble." Truth was, he liked the noise of it, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the fryer, the way the regulars nodded at him like he belonged. And maybe he stayed because it was where it all started, where he'd found Marcus and set everything in motion without even knowing it. Marcus came by sometimes. Two, not often, but enough to make it feel like he was part of the fabric now. The first time was a shock. Jamal was mid-shift, wiping down a booth, when the door chimed and there he was, looking like a different man entirely. His hair was trimmed neat, his button-down tucked in, and he carried himself with a quiet steadiness that made the alley version of him seem like a ghost. He slid into a booth near the window, ordered a coffee, black, no sugar, and watched the street outside while Jamal worked. When the rush slowed, Marcus waved him over, sliding a 5 across the table like it was nothing. "Sit for a minute," he said, his voice warm but firm, like he wasn't taking no for an answer. Jamal hesitated, then dropped into the seat across from him, the vinyl creaking under his weight. "How you holding up?" he asked, fiddling with a napkin just to keep his hands busy. Marcus smiled, small and real, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Better than I've been in a long time," he said, wrapping his hands around the mug. "David's got me seeing a doctor, head stuff. You know, memories are still patchy, but they're coming back, bits and pieces." He tapped his temple, the scar catching the light. "Turns out I was a mechanic once. Worked on cars. Funny how that sticks when the rest don't." Jamal nodded, leaning back. "You remember anything else? Like, before you got lost?" Marcus's smile faded a little, his gaze drifting to the window. "Some," he said softly. "I had a shop, small place, downtown. Worked there 30 years. Then the accident. Car hit me. They say, knocked everything loose up here." He tapped his head again, then shrugged. "Next thing I knew, I was wandering, didn't even know my own name some days. Jamal's chest tightened. Picturing it, Marcus out there, alone, piecing together a life he couldn't hold on to. But you're good now, he asked, needing to hear it. Marcus met his eyes, steady and sure. You are non on Turatum. Akamant, kid. I'm good, Wasano. Got my boy back. Got a roof. Got some purpose. was. All 'cause you didn't keep walking that night. Jamal looked down, heat creeping up his neck. He didn't know what to say to that. Never did when Marcus or David got heavy like this. So he just nodded, letting the quiet settle between them. That became their thing. Marcus showing up every couple of weeks, sitting in that same booth. Sipping coffee while Jamal finished his shift. Sometimes he'd talk. Stories about the shop. About David as a kid. About the wife he'd lost to cancer a decade back. Other times he'd just sit, watching the world go by, like he was making up for all the days he'd been lost in it. Jamal didn't mind. It felt right, having him there, like a thread tying the past to the now. Lena noticed it too. One night, after Marcus had stopped by the apartment with a bag of groceries, insisting it was just extra stuff he didn't need, she sat Jamal down at the kitchen table, her hands folded tight. That man thinks the world of you, she said, her voice low, serious. You know that, right? Jamal shrugged, picking at a scratch in the wood. He's just grateful. Maherdeb. Anybody would have known in my matunum. She cut him off, sharp enough to make him look up. Anybody wouldn't. You did. You saw him when nobody else did, and you brought him home. That's you. Jamal, not luck, not chance. You're in creek at a shitty turn, shafwim. Her eyes held his, fierce and proud. And for once he didn't look away. He felt it then, deep and real, the weight of what he'd done, not just for Marcus, but for them, Dibrobi mimmed. Ha some. For her, the months rolled on, winter giving way to a soggy spring. And the changes kept coming. Lena's job turned into a promotion, assistant to some exec, with a desk and a nameplate and a paycheck that let her pay off the electric bills 6 months ahead. She started smiling more. Not just at home, but everywhere. Like she'd remembered how Jamal hit his junior year, the college prep stuff kicking in with tutoring sessions that made calculus feel less like a foreign language. He still worked at Jimmy's, but now it was just weekends. The extra cash going into a savings account Lena insisted he start. For when you're out there changing the world, Mart, T.U., she'd said, half teasing, half serious. Then came the day that tied it all together. It was a Saturday in May, the air warm and thick with the promise of summer, when the diner door swung open and Marcus walked in, David trailing behind. Jamal was behind the counter. Osner, pouring coffee for a regular. When he saw them, Marcus in a polo shirt, David in a blazer that probably cost more than Jamal's rent. They didn't sit this time. They headed straight for him. Marcus's grin wide and bright. David's quieter but just as real. Got something for you, Marcus said, pulling an envelope from his pocket and sliding it across the counter. Jamal frowned, setting the coffee pot down. What's this? He asked, picking it up. The paper was thick, official looking, and when he opened it, his breath caught. Inside was a certificate, some community award, outstanding youth or something, with his name in bold letters and a check. A big one, 4 digits big. Local folks heard what you did, David said, leaning against the counter. Dad wouldn't shut up about it. So they put this together, figured it's a start, maybe for school, maybe for whatever you want. Jamal stared at the check, his hands steady but his mind spinning. I don't know what to say, he managed, voice thick. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, his grip strong now, not shaky like it had been that first night. You don't gotta say nothing. Just keep being you, kid. That's enough. David nodded, adding, and tell your mom we're throwing a barbecue next weekend. Her and you, our place. No excuses. Jamal laughed. At a real, unguarded sound that surprised even him. All right, no one to know, he said, tucking the envelope into his apron. She'll be there. They stayed a little longer. Marcus ordering his usual coffee. David chatting with Jimmy about some car thing, but Jamal barely heard it. He was too busy feeling it. the way the pieces had fallen together, the way one cold night in an alley had spun out into this. He didn't know where it'd take him next. College. Maybe, or something bigger. But for the first time, he wasn't scared to find out. That night, when he got home and showed Lena the check, she cried quiet tears, the kind she didn't let him see often. "You did this," she whispered, pulling him into a hug that smelled like her lavender lotion in home. "All of this." Yummy son. And as he hugged her back, the diner grease still clinging to his shirt, Jamal knew she was right. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about them, about the life they were building, one small, stubborn choice at a time. The barbecue at the Reed's place was unlike anything Jamal Carter had ever seen up close. It was the kind of Saturday where the sun hung high and lazy in a cloudless sky, the air thick with the smell of charcoal smoke and sizzling meat. David's house, Marcus's house now too, Jamal figured, sat at the edge of that same suburban neighborhood where he'd left Marcus months ago. A sprawling two-story with a wide backyard that stretched out like something from a magazine. The lawn was clipped perfect, green enough to look fake, and strung with little white lights that twinkled even in the daylight. A long table groaned under platters of ribs, burgers, potato salad, and cornbread, while a smoker puffed away in the corner, tended by David in a crisp polo and apron that said Grill Master in red stitching. Kids ran around, shrieking and dodging between adults, while a Bluetooth speaker pumped out old-school R&B, Marvin Gaye, Aretha, the kind of stuff Lena loved. It was loud, chaotic, alive, and Jamal stood at the edge of it all, hands shoved in his pockets, feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's life. Lena fit right in, though. She'd shown up in a sundress she hadn't worn in years, yellow, bright against her skin, and a pair of sandals Jamal didn't even know she owned. She was laughing now, loud and unguarded, stirring a pitcher of lemonade while chatting with David's wife. Tara, a short, curvy woman with a quick smile and a baby on her hip, Jamal watched from the patio steps, his sneakers scuffing the wood, a plastic cup of sweet tea sweating in his hand. He'd never seen his mom like this. Not this relaxed, this free. She caught his eye and waved him over, her grin wide. "Get over here, and so, boy, and stop looking like you lost," she called, and Tara laughed, nudging her like they'd known each other forever. Jamal smirked, shaking his head, but he stayed put, letting the moment sink in. This was what normal felt like. He guessed, the kind of normal he'd only seen on TV, where people had yards and barbecues and didn't count every penny twice. Marcus found him there, ambling over with a plate of ribs in one hand and a cane in the other. Not because he needed it, Jamal figured, but because it made him look distinguished, like some wise old uncle in a movie. His hair was freshly trimmed, his polo tucked into khakis, and his eyes had that sharp, clear look they'd taken on since he'd come back to himself. "You gonna stand there all day, or you gonna eat something?" Marcus asked, settling onto the step beside him with a grunt. He held out the plate, the ribs glistening with sauce, and Jamal took one, the meat warm and tender between his fingers. "Figured I'd let everybody else fight over it first," Jamal said, biting into the rib. The flavor hit him hard, sweet, smoky, a little spicy, and he couldn't help the small hum that slipped out. Marcus chuckled, wiping his hands on a napkin. "Smart kid. But your family here, you don't gotta wait." Jamal paused mid-chew, the word family landing heavier than he expected. He glanced at Marcus, who was watching him with that quiet, knowing look, like he could see right through the walls Jamal didn't even know he'd put up. "Family. Sakishanam," Jamal said, keeping his tone light, but his chest felt tight. Marcus nodded, leaning back on his elbows, the cane resting across his lap. "Yeah, na wait or wait soon. You and Lena, you're part of this now. Ain't no going back." He said it like it was a fact, simple and solid. And Jamal didn't argue. He just took another bite, letting the taste ground him while the music and laughter swirled around them. David joined them a few minutes later, flipping a spatula in one hand, his grin easy and wide. "Y'all good over here?" he asked, wiping sweat off his brow with the back of his arm. "Dad, Saradiaturn, you telling him all your old mechanic stories yet?" Marcus snorted, waving him off. "Boy, wuffer money might. I got better stories than that. Telling him how you cried when I fixed your bike chain that one time? Thought I was some kind of superhero." David laughed, loud and deep, the sound carrying over the yard. "Men muatanashu. I was 6. Let it go." He turned to Jamal, shaking his head. Don't listen to him. He's been milking that one for years. Jamal grinned, the tension in his shoulders easing. This was easy, easier than he'd thought it'd be, sitting here with Marcus and David. Like he wasn't just some kid who'd stumbled into their lives by accident. The afternoon stretched on, the sun dipping low and painting the sky orange and pink. Jamal ended up roped into a game of tag with Tara's kids. Two little girls with braids and gap-toothed smiles who kept calling him Cousin Jamal like it was official. He didn't correct them. It felt too good. Chasing them around the grass, their giggles ringing in his ears. Lena watched from the table, her lemonade glass raised in a mock toast. And when he caught her eye, she mouthed, You're good at this." He rolled his eyes but couldn't hide the smile tugging at his lips. Later, as the crowd thinned and the lights in the yard glowed brighter against the dusk, David pulled Jamal aside. They stood near the smoker, the heat still radiating off it, the air thick with the scent of hickory. David's face was serious now, the easy grin replaced by something steadier. "I meant what I said back at the diner," he started, his voice low, "about school, about you not having to worry. But it's more than that now." He paused, glancing over at Marcus, who was showing one of the kids how to toss a frisbee. "Dad's been talking about you nonstop. Says you're the reason he's still here. And I think he's right." Jamal shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of it. "I just did what anybody would have," he mumbled, kicking at a patch of grass. David shook his head. "Firm, you're firm, now, you didn't? You stopped? You cared. That's not anybody. A sucker your serotonin. That's you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. His business card, sleek and embossed with the name of his company. "This is me saying we're in this with you. Not just money. Not just school, whatever you need. You got us." "Okay." Jamal took the card, the edges smooth under his fingers, and nodded, his throat too tight to speak. David clapped him on the back, then headed back to the grill, leaving Jamal standing there, the card burning a hole in his pocket. He looked out at the yard, Lena laughing with Tara, Marcus tossing that frisbee, the kids darting around like fireflies, and felt something settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just a barbecue. This was a promise. Out to the forni could nursery a tether, a new kind of home. Summer came fast after that, the days stretching long and hot, the city shimmering under a haze of humidity. Jamal turned 17 in June, and Lena threw him a party at the apartment. Nothing fancy, just cake and a few friends from school. But Marcus and David showed up too, bringing a stack of pizzas and a gift. A beat-up old toolbox Marcus had dug out of his garage. "From my shop days," he'd said, handing it over with a grin. "Figure you might need it someday. Fixin' stuff's in your blood now." Jamal laughed, running his fingers over the rusted metal, and kept it by his bed like a trophy. School started again in August, his senior year, and it hit different this time. The college prep program had him taking practice SATs, meeting with advisors who threw around words like scholarship and Ivy League like they weren't pipe dreams. His grades were solid, better than solid, and his teachers started looking at him different. Like they saw something he hadn't yet. He still worked at Jimmy's on weekends, the diner a constant in the whirlwind. But now he had plans, real ones, scribbled in a notebook he kept under his pillow. Engineering, maybe, or something with cars, like Marcus. He didn't know for sure, but the not knowing didn't scare him anymore. One Saturday in September, Marcus showed up at the diner alone. No David this time, just him and that cane he carried more for show than need. He slid into his usual booth, ordered his coffee, and waited till Jamal's shift ended. When the last customer left and Jimmy flipped the closed sign, Marcus waved him over. "Got something to show you," he said, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. They jangled, old and scratched, attached to a leather fob that looked worn from years of use. Jamal frowned, sliding into the booth. "Never said what's in that." And Marcus's eyes twinkled, a mischief Jamal hadn't seen before. "My old shop's still sitting there, downtown, empty since the accident. Been thinking about it a lot lately, and I figure it's time to dust it off. Could use some help, though someone with good hands. Good head." He slid the keys across the table, the metal clinking against the formica. "What you say? Kidwardy Heber showing me where for. Want to fix some cars with an old man." Jamal stared at the keys, his pulse kicking up. He could see it, grease under his nails. The hum of an engine. Marcus barking orders like some grizzled mentor. It wasn't just a job, it was a piece of Marcus's life. handed over like a gift. "You serious?" he asked, voice low, like he was afraid to jinx it. Marcus nodded, leaning forward. "Dead serious. Ain't no one else I'd trust it with." Jamal picked up the keys, the weight of them solid in his palm, and grinned wide, unguarded, the kind of grin that felt like letting go. "Yes, he said. "I'm in this morning." Marcus clapped his hands once, sharp and loud, his laugh filling the empty diner. "That's my boy," he said, and Jamal felt it, right there, in that greasy booth that he really was. The shop opened a month later, a small garage with a faded sign that read Reed's Repairs. The paint chipped, but the name still proud. Jamal spent his weekends there, learning from Marcus how to change oil, fix a carburetor, listen to an engine like it was telling a story. It was hard, messy work, but it fit him, like a gear clicking into place. Lena came by sometimes, bringing lunch and teasing them about the grease stains. But her pride showed in the way she lingered, watching them work. David pitched in too, handling the books, turning the place into something real again. And Jamal, he kept going, school, the shop, the diner, building something bigger than he'd ever dreamed. One turn of a wrench, one late-night study session, one small choice at a time. It all traced back to that alley, to a cold night when he'd stopped instead of walking away. He didn't know where it'd end, but he knew this. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Lena, Marcus, David, a family stitched together from chance and kindness, and that was enough to carry him anywhere. The first winter Jamal Carter spent working at Reed's Repairs was a brutal one, the kind that sank its teeth into the city and didn't let go. Snow piled up in gray drifts along the streets, turning to slush under boots and tires, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old garage like it was trying to claw its way inside. The shop was a drafty box of concrete and corrugated metal, its single space heater rattling in the corner, barely keeping the chill at bay. Jamal's breath puffed out in white clouds as he hunched over a rusted Chevy engine, his fingers stiff from the cold despite the gloves Marcus had tossed him that morning. Grease streaked his knuckles, black and thick, and the sting of it mixed with the sharp bite of December air. But he didn't mind, not really. There was something about the work, the way the pieces fit together, that warmed him from the inside out. Even when the thermometer dipped below zero, Marcus was there too, perched on a stool by the workbench, a wool cap pulled low over his ears and a blanket draped across his shoulders like a cape. He'd taken to supervising more these days, his hands not as steady as they'd been back in the fall, but his eyes were still sharp, catching every move Jamal made. "You're rushing it," he grumbled, pointing a gnarled finger at the wrench in Jamal's hand. "Slow down, feel the bolt. Ain't no point in stripping it, 'cause you're trying to beat the clock." Jamal huffed. "What do you need to function on?" A half smile tugging at his lips. But he eased up, turning the wrench with deliberate care. Marcus nodded, satisfied, and went back to sipping his coffee, black, steaming, the mug chipped from years of use. The shop had been open 2 months now, and it was starting to feel like something real. Word had spread, slow at first, then faster, about the little garage downtown where an old mechanic and a kid could fix anything with wheels. Customers trickled in, a single mom with a sputtering minivan, a cabbie whose taxi kept stalling, an old guy in a pickup who swore nobody else could tune his engine right. Jamal learned fast, soaking up Marcus's tricks, how to listen for a misfire, how to tell a bad alternator from a dying battery, like they were secrets passed down through generations. It wasn't just the work, though. It was the way people looked at him now, not as some teenager bussing tables at Jimmy's, but as someone who knew what he was doing, someone they could trust. That shift hit him quiet and deep, a pride he didn't know how to name. Lena saw it too. She'd swing by after her shift at David's company, her new coat bought with her first bonus, buttoned tight against the wind. She'd bring thermoses of soup or hot chocolate, leaning against the workbench with a smirk while Jamal and Marcus argued over a carburetor. "Y'all sound like an old married couple." "Free," she'd tease, and Marcus would cackle, slapping the table. Done. While Jamal rolled his eyes and tried not to laugh. But she'd linger, watching him work, her gaze soft in a way it hadn't been when he was just scraping by at the diner. One night, as they walked home through the snow, she looped her arm through his and said, "You're good at this. You know, this is permanent one. Real good." Her voice was steady, proud, and Jamal ducked his head, muttering a thanks. That didn't quite cover how much it meant. David kept the shop running smooth behind the scenes, stopping by every couple of weeks with spreadsheets and invoices. His suit jacket swapped for a hoodie when he stayed to help. He'd taken to calling Jamal the apprentice, half joking but with a respect that made Jamal stand a little taller. The money wasn't huge, not yet, but it was steady. Enough to cover parts and keep the lights on. With a little left over for Jamal to sock away, David had big plans, talking about expanding, maybe hiring another hand. But Marcus always waved him off. This ain't no empire. Boy, he'd say, just a place to fix what's broke. Jamal liked that, liked the smallness of it, the way it felt like theirs. Christmas came quick, the city decked out in lights and tinsel. And for the first time, Jamal and Lena didn't have to scrape by on ramen and a single string of bulbs. Lena's promotion had padded their bank account, and Jamal's shop cash added a little extra. So they splurged ham, sweet potatoes, a real tree that filled the apartment with the sharp scent of pine. Marcus and David came over Christmas Eve, bringing a pie Tara had baked and a bottle of cider that David swore was non-alcoholic, until Marcus winked and said, "Don't tell the preacher." They crowded around the wobbly kitchen table, plates piled high, laughter bouncing off the walls. Jamal caught Lena watching him across the table, her eyes glistening, and when she raised her glass, plastic, chipped. "But hers," she said, "to family," her voice thick. Marcus clinked his mug against hers. David nodded, and Jamal felt it right there, in that cramped, warm room, that this was what he'd been chasing all along. School picked up after the holidays, senior year barreling toward spring like a train he couldn't slow down. The college prep program had him swamped, SATs looming, applications piling up, advisors pushing him toward schools he'd never dared dream of. Howard, Morehouse, and one. Even MIT, names that felt too big, too far, until Marcus sat him down one night at the shop and said, "You got the head for it, kid. Don't sell yourself short." Jamal started believing it, piece by piece. The idea of a future beyond the diner and the garage taking root. He aced his practice tests, his scores climbing high enough to make his advisor grin and slap him on the back. "You're going places, Carter," she'd said, and for once, he didn't brush it off. The shop stayed his anchor. Though anymore, Saturdays and Sundays, he'd be there, elbow deep in engines. Marcus at his side barking orders or spinning stories about the old days. How he'd rebuilt a '67 Mustang from scratch. How he'd raced it once and nearly got arrested. Jamal listened, laughed, learned. The rhythm of it settling into his bones. The customers kept coming. The jobs got bigger, restoring a vintage Harley, overhauling a delivery van, and Jamal's hands grew surer, his instincts sharper. Marcus noticed started stepping back more, letting him take the lead. "You don't need me hovering no more." He'd say, but he'd still watch, pride flickering in his eyes like a spark. Then came the day that changed the game. It was late March, the snow finally melting into muddy puddles, when a guy in a slick suit rolled up to the shop in a gleaming BMW. He was tall, mid-40s, with a voice that carried like he was used to being heard. "Heard you're the ones who fix what others can't," he said, popping the hood. The engine was a mess, overheating, rattling, a puzzle of bad wiring and worn parts. Marcus leaned on his cane, squinting at it, then nudged Jamal. "Your call, Kit." Jamal hesitated, the guy's stare heavy on him, but he nodded, diving in. It took hours, tracing lines, swapping parts, testing and retesting. But when he turned the key and the engine purred smooth and steady, the guy whistled, impressed. "You're good," he said, pulling out a card. "Name's Carter. No relation, I'm guessing." He smirked, handing it over. "I run a dealership uptown. Could use someone like you. Full-time. Good pay. Benefits." "Think about it." Jamal took the card, his pulse racing, and Marcus grinned like he'd known this was coming. That night, he showed the card to Lena, her eyes widening as she read it. "This for real?" she asked. And when he nodded, she hugged him tight, whispering, "You're making it, baby." He didn't say yes to the offer, not right away, but he kept the card on his dresser, next to Marcus's toolbox, a possibility he could feel in his hands. Marcus clapped him on the back the next day, saying, "Told you, kid, world's yours now." And David, when he heard, just nodded, adding, "Whatever you pick, we've got your back." By April, Jamal had his college acceptance letters. Howard first, then Morehouse. To Ruffin assented 30 years or didn't be. Nimiti still pending and the shop was humming. A second bay added with David's investment. He stood in the garage one evening, the sun sinking low, grease under his nails and the future wide open ahead of him. Lena was at home, cooking something that had filled the apartment with warmth. Marcus was inside, tallying the day's jobs, his cane tapping the floor. David was due any minute with Tara and the kids, turning the shop into a makeshift family hub. And Jamal, he was right where he'd started. In a way, building, fixing, choosing to stop instead of walk away. It had taken him from an alley to here, to a life he'd made with his own hands. And as the city buzzed around him, he knew this was just the beginning.